Well, good morning, everyone. Welcome to this short, sharp session for half an hour on empowering employees. It's always the perennial challenge to try and get the best out of employees. And what I mean by empowering is that person taking responsibility for their work and being proactive. And it's often it's a difficult challenge for any leader. So I want to talk about that today, give you a few tips on how you might do that from my latest book, Breaking the Proactive Paradox. So welcome wherever you are. I'll share my screen and we'll get underway. Okay, so let's just a little bit about me. I know many of you have, this isn't your first time in one of these sessions, but I just give you a little bit of background about who I am. And you can see, obviously, I write books. And I've actually got 10 books out now, and number 10 is this book here that I'm going to talk about, which is Breaking the Proactive Paradox. You can see that I speak. I do a lot of platform speaking. I do executive coaching all over the country. Not so much in the last couple of years, as you can imagine, but certainly a lot on Zoom. And you can see I still play rugby in the Golden Oldies competition here in Brisbane, which is pretty sad when you think about it, but it's really more of a social thing than anything else. So let's get underway. Now, one of the big objections that people have when we talk about empowering people is that people will often say to me, well, look, I've tried everything and my team members just don't seem to want to be proactive. So what do I do? They keep coming to me for answers. I can't seem to get them to back their own independent judgment. So that's a fair question, and I guess that's why you're here. So let's have a look at what we're covering. So basically, what I want to cover is I want to talk about what the proactive paradox is. Now, it's a way of me explaining this frustration that people have around getting people to be proactive. I obviously will talk about the 4 strategies for breaking the proactive paradox, because that's why you're here. And I've got a special offer for you at the end of this presentation. So first of all, a paradox, what is it? We use the word a lot. A paradox is where, what comes first? Is it the chicken and the egg? So for example, that's a typical sort of example. Does the chicken come first and then the egg come second, or the egg come first and the chicken comes second? So it's one of those interesting conundrums that we have in life. And so what I wanted to do now is just share with you what this proactive paradox is. Now, it's a very simple concept, really, and I'm just going to lead you through it so that we understand it. And I get lots and lots of managers come up to me in seminars and workshops, and they say, I just can't get my employees, I can't get my team members to show more initiative. But funnily enough, I get a lot of employees that come up to me too and say, my manager doesn't allow me to show initiative, or perhaps they're micromanagers. So I get this kind of interesting situation or paradox in the in workshops. So at the very first stage of any relationship, that is a manager and a team member, both of them are on the same page. What I mean by that is that the leader wants the employee to show initiative. So most leaders do want people to show prudent initiative. They don't want them to be doing ridiculous things, but they do want them to show show their initiative, to back their own judgment. But also, employees, in most cases, not all cases, but in most cases, they want to show initiative as well. So both of them are on the same page. And then what happens is that perhaps there's a team meeting and the leader says to his or her team members, I really want you to back yourself. I want you to show independent judgment. I want you to be proactive when the opportunity arises. And everyone in the room is sitting there very quietly and they're listening to what the manager says. And if you could read their mind, they're probably thinking to themselves, I don't think he or she really means that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to sit on my hands, because I don't honestly believe the leader means what they say. So nothing happens. Now, of course, the manager observes that nothing happens. And what he or she does then is there's a vacuum to be filled. And so that vacuum is filled by the manager getting involved in the, what they need to do. So they fill the vacuum. And what happens is the employees are sitting there and they're thinking to themselves, aha, I knew my manager wasn't serious about showing initiative, and I'm glad I made the call I did. So you can see it's a chicken and the egg situation. Both become frustrated with each other because both of them believe that they should be doing something that they're not. The employee believes the manager should be allowing them to be more autonomous, and the leader believes that the employee should be showing more independent judgment. And that's what we call the proactive paradox. There's basically 3 steps involved in that paradox. Step 1 is there's genuinely an agreement to start with. That is, the manager wants the employee to show initiative and the employee is quite willing to show initiative. So there's agreement at the beginning. There's a bit of skepticism because the team member doesn't believe that the manager is serious about them showing initiative. So they do nothing. And then when they do nothing and the manager jumps in and fills the vacuum, there's confirmation that they were right in the first place. Although, of course, there's frustration from both parties. So that's the proactive paradox. So the question now is, how do we break this? Well, there are 4 strategies to break this proactive paradox. And what I'm going to do is give you a very brief overview of them because we've only got a short amount of time together. And then in subsequent webinars, we'll talk in more detail about each of these 4 strategies. So the 4 strategies that I highlight in my book, Breaking the Proactive Paradox, are shared purpose, boundary management, information exchange, and proactive accountability. So what I'm going to do is explain each of these briefly with you. And you don't have to use them all, of course. And in fact, I don't suspect you should use them all, but your industries, have got their own sort of uniqueness, and you have to work out what will work well in your industry. So let's start with shared purpose and actually understand what it means. Now, shared purpose basically means that we're sharing the purpose by aligning the needs and interests of the organization, the individual. So this alignment or this clarity around purpose gives people an understanding of where they should show initiative. So it gives employees a very clear idea of what it is that they should be doing because there's a clear purpose. One of the most interesting exercises that you can do with your team is when you get them together, next time when you're having a team meeting, ask them what our purpose is as a team. In other words, go around the table, have a listen to what people have to say, and you might find something very interesting. You might find that people struggle to give you a sense of purpose or what the team purpose is. That could be the first interesting thing. Secondly, you might find that if you've got 5 or 6 in the team, they've all got different, they all have a different perspective on what the purpose of the team is. And therein lies the issue that everyone's not sure of what the team's ultimate purpose is. Now, if you think about it, if people aren't clear about what their purpose is, then obviously they're not going to back themselves. They're going to be highly reactive rather than proactive because they're not sure. They're not sure where the line in the sand is. So what shared purpose does is give the team some real crystal clear clarity around what their purpose is. And then, of course, once people know what their purpose is, it provides a psychological safety and that people can go ahead and back themselves because they know confidently that what they're doing is actually in alignment with the purpose of the team. Now, there are a number of different practices you can use, and I obviously won't get a chance to go through all of these today, but in subsequent webinars, I will talk about these things. So if the leader models the way, in other words, they walk the talk, in other words, if the leader is very consistent in their purpose and what they believe is important and not important, and they work in those areas, then that presents a very good example for the rest of the team members of what to do. and where we should be putting our energy in terms of being proactive. Developing a team values charter is a very good idea, and I ran one of these webinars a couple of weeks ago, and it was a very popular one, and it's a very simple process to run. Offering support and encouragement could clearly be a way of articulating what the purpose is. So using those moments, those corridor conversations, so that people are on track and they understand what the clear purpose of the team is. And of course, if a leader gives regular feedback, and these feedback should be given for critical incidents. Now, if leaders do that, then it's very clear to the person receiving that feedback where the line in the sand is. So there's some practices around that. So if people are crystal clear about the purpose of the team, they will feel confident enough to back their own judgment in the right place at the right time in the right way. Now, the second strategy is what we call boundary management. Now, boundary management means careful communication of the kinds of initiative desired and where it shouldn't be displayed. So what this strategy does is it says to people, in these areas here, we're very happy for you to show independent judgment. But in these areas here, which are perhaps more regulatory, or there might be safety issues or whatever, in those areas, we want you to do it by the book. We want you to follow the process and the procedure. So what boundary management does is it not only explains when proactive behaviour is appropriate, but it also talks about when proactive behaviour is inappropriate. So it gives people some clarity around the areas where they should be backing their own judgment, and in other areas where they really should be just following the process or the procedures. Now, there are a couple of things that you can do around that will help. I mean, for example, you can facilitate a team debrief. So if your organisation is very much a project-based organisation and you involve yourself in a project, and at the end of the project, if you sit down and complete what we call an after-action review, which is based on 3 simple questions: what went well, what didn't go well, and what will we do differently? And getting the whole team engaged in that process of discussion around those 3 questions provides some clarity around where independent judgment is appropriate and when it's inappropriate. So that's a very good strategy. Unfortunately, in my experience and observations, organisations don't use after-action reviews very well. They're too busy getting on to the next project, and the learning is lost from the previous project. So those 3 simple questions can be very, very useful. The other thing, of course, in a one-on-one situation is actually to spend time coaching people. And by coaching people, I'm talking about having a conversation. And by having a conversation, the leader can really align their view of the world with the team member's view of the world. So that if the team member says something that, and the leader can then say, well, in those areas, please go ahead and be proactive. You don't need to come and talk to me about that. So group coaching, individual coaching can be very, very effective around that. So there's a couple of practices that might help. Now, the third strategy around proactive or breaking the proactive paradox is information exchange. And what that simply means is that there's an exchange channel that's open between the managers and the employees, and they can work collaboratively on a particular task or project or activity. Now, not all projects, tasks, and activities would be ideal for information exchange, but I'll give you a couple of examples. Strategic planning would be one where you would want your team members involved in that process. So, for example, if you're planning out next year and some of the details that are required for that, it would be a good idea to use information exchange. Why? Because you want your team members on board. You want them to be engaged in the process and to contribute. And of course, several heads are better than one anyway. So that would be an opportunity where you would engage other people in the discussion. And there are a couple of ways that you can do that, of course. One is that you can create a team purpose statement. And in my book, I talk about how to do that. It sounds like it might be a little bit cumbersome. It's not. You could actually do this in a very short amount of time. And essentially, by creating that statement, people are very, very clear about what's expected of them. So in fact, you could kill two birds with one stone by using boundary management, by creating this information exchange, by creating this purpose. What you can actually do then is create a shared purpose environment. So that becomes very useful. And I find that team members often are very reluctant to do that. And it's often because the organization has its own purpose statement and people feel that that might intrude if they sit down and do that. But in actual fact, it is a very good thing to do. Obviously, the purpose of the team is a subset of the overall purpose of the organization. And what you can do then is you can talk about creating what we might call a behavior agreement. What are some of the values and behaviors that are going to be consistent with achieving that particular purpose? And that gives, again, some psychological safety to team members to know where the line is drawn around, where they can exercise proactive behavior and when they can't. So creating a behavior agreement can be very useful as well. And again, these things don't take a long time. And you'll find that in my book, I explain this in great detail. It's not a hugely difficult exercise. In fact, it's a very affirming exercise because it puts everybody on the same page, which is ultimately the crux of why the proactive paradox is a problem. So there's three different approaches. Now, the one thing these three have got in common, of course, is it's all about trying to give people opportunities to exert their own influence and their own initiative at different points during the work that you do. So they're all trying to open up and empower people to show more initiative. Now, the fourth one is slightly different, and let me go to that one. The fourth one, which we call proactive accountability, is slightly different, and it wouldn't always be applicable for all of your organizations. So in a military organization or a highly bureaucratic organization, proactive accountability is very, very useful. Ultimately, what it means is that proactive accountability is letting employees know that they're quite open to exercising independent judgment, but only at their own risk. So in other words, if you go off and you do something that is proactive and it goes pear-shaped, then I'm afraid you're the one that'll take the rap. That is the team member that does that. Now, in situations where you've got unethical behavior, maybe dealing in situations in crises, that would be very, very useful because you want people to be able to back themselves in those sort of circumstances. So, for example, if there is unethical behavior going on in your organization and you have a team member that can see that and they want to report that, they should be encouraged to do that. And of course, they need to have their facts clear about what that is in order to, but of course, if they're just doing it because they want to carry a grudge or something against someone else, well, of course, that's got to come back to bite them at some point. So and I sort of explained these earlier, but there are two particular practices where this would be very, very relevant. And of course, unethical behavior is not confined to one industry. We find this in lots of industries, but if somebody is doing something unethical, say it might be a manager, then it takes a little bit of courage for that person who observes that behavior to step forward and to report that, because they may feel that there are, career limiting consequences for doing that. So there needs to be a process in place that allows people to do that in a safe way, where anonymity is the order of the day. And of course, procedural justice would also indicate that the person that's been accused of the unethical behaviour is given an opportunity to have a say in that as well. And of course, we've just been through the pandemic, or we're going through it depending on where you are. But also in most crises, we do want people not necessarily to play it safe, but we need people who will take prudent risk. And so we want people to back their proactive judgment in those, because all the rules are different, aren't they, in a crisis? So in a crisis, of course, you can't just pull out the rule book, because it's a completely unusual and unique set of circumstances, and you need people to back themselves in that case. So I would suggest to you that that last one, proactive accountability, would only really be applicable in organisations that are very, very bureaucratic with a chain of command. In other words, of the four that I'm sharing with you, this is the one that is probably the one that discourages proactive behaviour the most. But it's also saying that there is a scope, there is a place to be proactive, but just understand that if you do act in a proactive way, that you will be ultimately accountable for whatever those results are. So they're the four stages. And of course, in the book, I go into great detail on some very practical exercises around each of those four. And I'm just sharing the concepts with you today to give you some sense of what they actually mean. And if you've got any questions that you'd like to ask at this point, just go to the Q&A box or the Q&A box, I think, is available, and just type in your question. I'll be happy to respond to it the moment I see it. Now, let's look at the framework overall. So I call this the proactive framework, and you can see that on the page there, you've got the four different strategies: shared purpose, information exchange, boundary management, and proactive accountability. And you can see that on a 2x2 matrix, there is a couple of variables. So if we talk about stimulating proactive behaviour, that is getting people to show more initiative and judgment without coming to you for every single reason, then the two that are most relevant there are shared purpose and information exchange. So these two are very relevant there. But if we're talking about regulating proactivity, in other words, only using it in certain places and at certain times, we're really talking about boundary management and proactive accountability. So boundary management, remember, is saying that in these areas here, you can show initiative, but in these areas here, we want you to follow the procedures manual. Whereas proactive accountability is saying you can still show proactivity, but just understand that you will ultimately be accountable for the outcome of that. So those are the two, that's the demarcation between the four of them there. And then over here on this side, you can see there's a manager initiative and employee initiated. So for example, shared purpose and boundary management is more management initiated. So in other words, the manager will set the boundaries around that. They will explain what the purpose is. They will explain when it's appropriate and inappropriate to show initiative. And down here, you've got the employee initiative, and that's where the employee, in the information exchange, the employee is expected to be involved in the decision-making in a collaborative way, and therefore it requires them to engage in the conversation. And in proactive accountability, of course, the employee is the one who will act proactively first and foremost, because they might see some behaviour that's not appropriate or whatever, and so the employee will initiate that. So it's just another way of clarifying where those four strategies fit on that particular framework. So there we are. There's the four strategies. Now, what I will be doing, of course, in future webinars is I'll be giving you an opportunity to understand these four in more detail. So keep your eyes peeled for that, because there'll be opportunities to actually work through some of those exercises that I've talked about and give you some kind of activities and things that you can do. But of course, all this is trying to do one simple thing, and that is to break this proactive paradox that I explained to you at the beginning of the webinar. Because if you don't use these strategies, nothing's really going to change. And you're going to create this real problem of the chicken and the egg. And you're going to say, you know, the employee is going to say, well, I'm only going to be proactive when my manager genuinely stops micromanaging me. And the manager's going to say, when are people going to jump in and show their initiative? And why do I always have to jump in and do things when I'm really expecting other people to jump in and do their bit? So you get this kind of argy-bargy, this paradox that occurs in the workplaces, and it really occurs across all industries. Now, one of the things I'd like to do, and many of you be aware because this isn't the first webinar you've been involved in, is every Friday at 10 a.m. Or around 10 a.m. It's not always 10 a.m. This is at Australian Eastern Standard Time, by the way, and I know we've got some people from overseas. What I do is I run a free 30-minute webinar on aspects of my books. Now, this isn't the only book, of course, I've written, but next week we are going to be talking about strategies for cultivating shared purpose. So what I'm going to do next week is I'm going into shared purpose. I'm going to talk in more detail about some of the activities that you can do in order to create and cultivate this shared purpose in your team. And you can see the date down the bottom here, next Friday and at 10 a.m. And there's the link. So at the end of this, I'm going to be sending you a copy of the slides. I'll send you a copy of the recording. And of course, all you need to do is click on that link and you can register for next Friday's webinar. So keep your eyes open for an email from me this afternoon with the slides and the recording and the invitation, of course, to attend next week. And for that matter, many other webinars that I'm running. Now, just before I wrap up and finish, I'd just like to share with you that my book can be pre-ordered. It's going to be out in 2 months. I have an American publisher who will have this book published in 2 months. Normally, the book is recommended retail price of $40 plus postage, but today I'm going to give you that book for $30 in order to, and of course, if you are willing to purchase my book and I pre-order, I'll sign it for you. And as soon as the books are hot off the press, I'll sign it for you and send it off to you at your address. So if you'd like to take advantage of that, and I hope you do, there's my email address on the right-hand side. And if you send me an email by the close of business today, I'll put you on the list and of course, send you out an invoice. And as soon as the book's available, you'll get a copy before anybody else. And of course, this book will be distributed all over the world. So folks, that's pretty much it from me. And I'm going to finish up at this point and thank everyone very much. I'll just get out of stop sharing for a moment. So thank you, everyone. I've enjoyed working with you today, and I hope that we'll see you in future webinars and look forward to that opportunity. And don't forget, you can purchase my book as well. So thank you, everyone. All the best and have a wonderful weekend. Thank you and goodbye.